It's 2:13 a.m. There's a reason you feel uncomfortable on social media, and it has nothing to do with insecurity. Your phone lights up the room just enough to make everything else feel darker. The world is quiet, but not peaceful. Not really. It's the kind of silence that presses against your chest, like something is waiting or watching. You scroll. Faces. Smiles. Filtered laughter. Carefully chosen moments that look effortless, but you know better. You feel better. There's something underneath all of it, something unspoken. And then for a moment your thumb stops. You see someone you know, not closely but enough. Their smile is perfect. Their caption is light. Everything about it says, I'm okay. But something in you tightens because you know they're not. You don't know how you know. There's no proof, no visible crack, no obvious signal. But you feel it in your chest like a quiet alarm. And suddenly, scrolling feels wrong. Like walking through a room full of people wearing masks, you can somehow see through, but no one else can. So you close the app, not because you're bored, but because it feels like too much. And here's the strange part. You rarely post anything yourself. Not really. Not the real things. Not the things that matter. Because somewhere deep inside, there's a quiet understanding you've never been able to fully explain. If they can't feel it, what's the point of showing it? And that's where this begins. You don't avoid social media because you're antisocial. You avoid it because you see too much. Not visually, not logically, emotionally. Where most people see a photo, you feel the moment behind it. Where they see a caption, you hear the tone that wasn't written. Where they see a highlight, you sense the absence. And over time, this does something to you. It makes performance feel exhausting because you know what it costs. You understand, on a level most people never consciously touch, that every image shared is a decision, a selection, a tiny act of emotional editing. And while others participate in that effortlessly, you hesitate. Because you're not just asking, does this look good? You're asking, is this true? And that question ruins everything. Because truth to you isn't just factual, it's emotional. It's layered. It's the difference between a smile that expresses joy and a smile that hides exhaustion. And once you can feel that difference, you can't unfeel it. So when it comes time to show yourself, really show yourself, you freeze. Not out of insecurity, but out of awareness. Because you know that whatever you post will never fully capture what you actually felt in that moment. And something inside you resists that reduction. You start thinking, if I share this, they'll misunderstand it. If I simplify this, I'll lose something real. If I make this digestible, I'll distort it. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin to withdraw. Not completely, but selectively. You become present, but not visible. Active, but not expressive. Because expressing yourself in a space that thrives on surface feels like trying to pour an ocean into a glass. And the worst part? People don't see the depth behind your silence. They interpret it. They label it. They assume you're private, distant, maybe even disconnected. But what they don't realize is this. You're not disconnected from people. You're overwhelmed by connection. You feel too much to package it neatly. You understand too deeply to present it casually. And that creates a quiet conflict inside you. A tension between wanting to be seen and refusing to be misseen. So you stay in the background, observing, feeling, understanding things no one is saying, and carrying a kind of emotional weight that doesn't translate into posts or captions. Because for you, expression isn't about visibility. It's about accuracy. And accuracy, in a world built on impression, feels almost impossible. But here's the part that most people never talk about. This ability to see beyond what's shown, this sensitivity to what's real versus what's performed, it doesn't just isolate you from social media. It starts to isolate you from people who rely on it to define themselves. And that's where something deeper begins to shift. Something you may not have even noticed yet. There's a specific kind of loneliness you carry, and it doesn't look like loneliness from the outside. You're surrounded by people. Conversations happen. Messages come in. Notifications light up your screen. But something feels off. Not empty, just unmatched. Because the way you experience people is not the way they experience you. You don't just hear words, you feel intention. You don't just notice presence, you sense absence. You don't just respond, you absorb. And over time, this creates an invisible gap. A gap between what's said and what's actually meant. A gap between what people show and what they're silently asking for. And you live in that gap, Most people never even realize it exists. But for you, it's where everything happens. It's where you notice the hesitation in someone's voice when they say, I'm fine. It's where you feel the emotional distance in a message that looks perfectly normal. It's where you recognize that someone isn't ignoring you. They're avoiding something within themselves. And because you can see all of this, you adjust. You soften your tone. You choose your words carefully. You hold back things you could say because you already know how they'll land. You start communicating not just based on what you feel, but based on what others are capable of receiving. And at first it feels like emotional intelligence, but over time it becomes emotional restraint. Because here's the truth no one prepares you for. When you constantly translate yourself into something others can handle, you slowly lose the version of you that didn't need translation. You begin to filter your depth, not because it's too much, but because it's too much for them. So you keep conversations lighter than you want. You avoid going as deep as you naturally would. You laugh at things that don't fully reach you, just to stay in rhythm with everyone else. And in doing that, you remain connected, but not fully known. And that's where the loneliness begins to change form. It's no longer about being alone. It's about being unseen in the middle of being surrounded. Because the version of you that people interact with is only a fraction of what you actually are. And the deeper parts, the parts that feel intensely, that notice everything, that understand without needing explanation, those parts stay quiet, not because they're weak, but because they've learned something important. Depth is not always welcomed. It's often misunderstood, sometimes avoided, and occasionally even rejected. So instead of risking that, you become selective, not just with what you post, but with what you reveal. You start choosing who gets access to your real thoughts, your real emotions, your real presence. And that circle becomes smaller, tighter, safer, but also lonelier. Because even though you can connect with almost anyone on a surface level, very few people can meet you where you naturally exist. And this creates a quiet question inside you, one you don't always say out loud. If I showed them everything, would they still stay? Or would they slowly pull back? Not because they don't care, but because they don't understand. So instead of testing that question, you avoid it. You stay just beneath the surface of visibility, not hidden, but not exposed either. And this is where your relationship with social media becomes even more complicated, because it's not just about avoiding superficiality anymore. It's about protecting something deeper, something more fragile than people realize. Your unfiltered emotional reality, the part of you that doesn't perform, that doesn't simplify, that doesn't reduce itself into something easily consumed. And the more you protect it, the more you begin to wonder something you haven't fully faced yet, not whether people can understand you, but whether you've made yourself too inaccessible to ever be understood at all. A keynote 3, when protection becomes disappearance. At some point, something subtle begins to change. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no clear moment where you decide, I'm going to hide. It's quieter than that, more reasonable. You tell yourself you're just being careful, selective, intentional. And at first that's true. You stop oversharing. You become more aware of who deserves access to your inner world. You protect your energy in ways you didn't before. It feels like growth, like maturity, like finally understanding your own boundaries. But underneath that, something else is forming, something you don't immediately notice. Because what begins as protection slowly becomes absence, not just from social media, but from spaces where you could have been known. You start holding back things you used to express freely, not because they're wrong, but because they feel too easily misunderstood. You stop explaining yourself, not because you have nothing to say, but because it feels like too much effort to translate. You begin to choose silence over misinterpretation, and that silence starts to grow. At first, it's comfortable, peaceful even. There's relief in not having to perform, relief in not having to simplify yourself for an audience that may never fully get you. But then a different feeling creeps in. Not loud, not overwhelming, just persistent, like a question that doesn't leave. Because while you've protected your depth, you've also removed the possibility of it being witnessed. And that creates a quiet contradiction inside you. You want to be understood, but you've made yourself harder to reach. You want real connection, but you've minimized the ways it can find you. You've eliminated the noise, but also the chance. And this is where many empaths find themselves without realizing it. not rejected, not misunderstood, but undiscovered. Because the truth is, people can't meet what they never see. They can't understand what you never reveal. And they can't connect with a depth that stays completely hidden. So over time, something begins to echo inside you. Maybe no one gets me. But the deeper truth, the one that's harder to admit, is this. Maybe no one has been given the chance to, because you've become so skilled at protecting your inner world that you've also become invisible within it. And invisibility feels safe. There's no judgment there, no misinterpretation, no disappointment. But there's also no recognition, no resonance, no moment where someone looks at you and says, I see exactly what you mean. And without that, even the strongest sense of self can begin to feel isolated. So you stay in that in-between space, not fully hidden, not fully expressed, present but distant. And from the outside, it might look like you're simply private. But internally, it feels more complex than that. Because part of you isn't just protecting yourself from being misunderstood. Part of you is starting to forget what it feels like to be fully seen. And that's where the deeper shift happens. The one that doesn't just affect how you show up online, but how you show up in your own life. Because when you spend too long unseen, you don't just question others' ability to understand you. You begin to question whether you're even meant to be understood at all. And that thought, that quiet, unsettling thought, is where everything starts to turn in a direction you didn't expect. There's a moment that comes, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, like something rising from beneath everything you've been holding in place. It's not a breakdown. It's not a crisis. It's a realization. That safety has started to feel a lot like absence. That peace has begun to resemble distance. And that control, the careful way you've managed what you reveal and what you keep hidden, has quietly cost you something you didn't mean to lose. Not your identity, not your depth, but your presence. Because there's a difference between knowing who you are and letting that version of you exist where others can actually meet it. And somewhere along the way, you chose to protect your depth so well that you also protected it from being experienced. Not just by others, but by life itself. You became precise with your expression, measured with your emotions, intentional with your visibility, and all of that made sense. It still does. But here's the truth that doesn't feel comfortable at first. The version of you that wants to be understood cannot survive entirely in hiding. It needs friction. It needs risk. It needs moments where something real is expressed, without knowing exactly how it will be received. Because understanding doesn't come from perfection. It comes from exposure, from allowing something true to exist outside of you, imperfectly, incompletely, and letting someone else meet it halfway. And yes, that's dangerous. Not physically, but emotionally. Because the moment you stop filtering everything, you open yourself to being misread, to being simplified, to being seen in a way that doesn't fully capture you. And that's exactly what you've been trying to avoid. But here's the part that changes everything. Being misunderstood is not the opposite of being understood. It's part of the process. Every real connection you've ever felt, every moment where someone truly got you, came after a risk. After a moment where you chose to show something real, without guarantee. And maybe you've forgotten that. Maybe the weight of always seeing deeper has made you expect instant recognition, immediate understanding, perfect alignment. But that's not how depth works in the real world. Depth reveals itself, layer by layer, and it requires participation, not just observation. So the question isn't whether people are capable of understanding you. The question is, have you given them anything real enough to try? Not polished, not reduced, not carefully edited into something that fits the environment, but something honest, something slightly uncomfortable, something that reflects the way you actually experience the world, even if it doesn't translate perfectly, because that's where the shift begins, not in becoming louder, not in becoming someone you're not, but in allowing small pieces of your real self to exist where they can be witnessed, a thought you don't usually share, a feeling you don't normally express, a moment that isn't aesthetic, but it's true, and at first it will feel unnatural, exposed, maybe even wrong, because you've trained yourself to avoid that space. But slowly something changes. You start to notice that not everyone misunderstands you, that some people don't need the full translation, that a few, just a few, can meet you closer than you expected. And those moments, they don't feel loud, they don't feel overwhelming, they feel quiet, accurate, like something inside you just clicked into place. And suddenly being seen doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like relief. But here's the part that matters most. You don't need everyone to understand you. You never did. You just needed to stop hiding from the possibility that someone might. Because the truth is, you were never too deep, never too much, never too difficult to understand. You were just waiting for a space where your depth didn't need to be reduced to be received. And that space, it doesn't appear on its own. It begins the moment you decide to step slightly out of hiding, not completely, not all at once, just enough for something real to finally reach the surface. And when it does, you'll start to notice something you haven't felt in a long time, not just that others can see you, but that you've allowed yourself to be seen again.